On today's podcast, we're talking about New Zealand, otherwise known as the land of the long white cloud, that beautiful country in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hello, and if you're a new listener, welcome. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And together with nearly 50 years of teaching English between us, Reza and I are going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, Reza?
I'm feeling fine, Craig. I'm feeling very festive. We're recording this at the festive season. What about you?
The same, exactly the same. We're recording this on Christmas Eve, the day before Christmas. So we're looking forward to a beautiful lunch. And before we talk about New Zealand today, we're going to look at a message we received in the comments section of the website at inglespodcast.com. And this message is from our friend Gabby from Peru. And she's speaking about episode 340, in which we spoke about names. We spoke about family names, Christian names, first names, maiden names, and Gabby wrote a comment. Would you like to read it, Reza?
Yes, here's what Gabby wrote. Hi guys, my full name is Gabriela Raquel Ruiz Sanchez, and I'm your Peruvian fan. Gabriela is my very first name. Raquel is my middle name. You know, I wouldn't say they're my very first name. The word very sounds a bit weird there, doesn't it? My first name.
Just my first name.
My first name is my first name. Raquel is my middle name. Ruiz is my father's family name. And Sanchez is, yeah, you guessed it, right? It's my mother's family name. That's what she wrote, eh? You guessed it, right? My mother's family name. I've also got some nicknames from my childhood.
1 second, Rook. What is a nickname?
Rook, Craig has called me. In my childhood, Rook was my nickname. Rook, it's a type of bird. It's similar to a crow, like a cuervo. And like many nicknames, sometimes people forget where they came from. I don't know why people called me Rook when I was a kid, but that was my nickname. So Gabriela, she says, I've also got some nicknames from my childhood, as I had quite nice, cute, round, rosy cheeks.
Cheeks? What are cheeks?
Cheeks are the fleshy bits on either side of your nose. In other words, mejillas. Yeah? So she had cute, round, rosy cheeks. By the way, that's a very good use of adjectives.
Yeah, they're in the correct order as well.
We've got an episode on that, by the way, everybody. If you go to inglespodcast.com/92, episode 92, you can see there about the correct order of adjectives. So she had quite nice, cute, round, rosy cheeks. And my father used to call me Globito, which in English is something like little balloon. My friends call me Gabi, Gabs, Gabushka. That's a Ukrainian friend. My close friend calls me Gabich. Other friends, Gabiota. Gaviota, like the bird, right? Isn't it? It's a seagull, isn't it? Gaviota.
Yeah, but Gaviota's with a V, and Gabby's written Gabiota with a B. Maybe it's a play on words.
Play on words, yeah.
Play on words, Gaviota.
Are you like a seagull, Gabby? I don't know. My cousins sometimes use yaki. I simply don't know where it came from. That's what I was thinking. Where does that come from? Yaki. Other people make fun of my last name, Sanchez, as they relate it to chancho. Pig. Oh, I didn't know chancho meant pig. That's a new word for me.
Maybe it's in Peru.
Is that a typical Peruvian word for pig? Chancho, for the CH phoneme. So they can say Gabriela Raquel Chanchito instead of Sanchez. Another one that just came to my mind is from my father's family name, Ruiz. Or sorry, I should probably say, in Peru, you probably say Ruiz, don't you? I'm saying it the Spanish way, not the Peruvian Spanish way. Ruiz or Ruiz, as it is somehow similar in sound with reír, laugh. And they call my sisters and me las Ruicinis or Ruicinis, meaning we tend to be smiley and fun gals. I like that word gals. That's a very American word. Fun gals. Gosh, Crazy, eh? Hugs, my dearest Reza and Craig.
Oh, it's a lovely message, and so many names, Gabriella, so many different names and ways of referring to you. That was really interesting to read. Thank you. Next, we have a message from Zeca from Brazil, who is currently living in New Zealand.
Hey, hello Fraser, hello Craig, how you guys doing? Here's Zeca speaking. I'm from Brazil, but since 2016 I've been living and working in New Zealand, and I'm listening to your podcasts for more or less 6 months. Yeah, and you guys are doing an amazing job. I have improved my English a lot, and I also have learned many things about the culture and history of other countries. Yeah, guys, if I can give a piece of advice to other listeners, I would say listen the podcast more than once, maybe more than twice, 3 times, because it helps a lot to improve our English. So do it, it works for me, and I believe it's gonna work for you as well. So, yeah, and if I can give an idea for a future podcast, I would say, why don't you guys talk about New Zealand? New Zealand is amazing. He has many points you guys can talk about. Yeah, so it's an idea for a future podcast. I'm not sure you guys have done already. So if not, please, it would be nice. Talk to you guys later. Bye.
Well, thank you, Zeca. That was a lovely message. We really enjoy getting your message all the way from New Zealand, from the other side of the world. Thank you very, very much. And your wish is our command. Today we're going to speak a little about New Zealand. Before we do that, though, just be careful, Zeca, about the way you're pronouncing your ED endings on past regular verbs. And there were 2 examples I heard. One was improved, the past tense of improve, and learned, the past tense of to learn. I suggest you go to episode 60 of the podcast and just do a little revision on how you can pronounce those ED endings, because there are 3 different ways of pronouncing regular verbs in the past. So that's inglespodcast.com/60. Any other comments, Reza?
That was a really nice message, Zeca. Thanks very much. I did notice 1 or 2 little grammar points we could improve. I think you said, I'm listening to your podcast for, was it 2 years? But I'm listening, no, because you started in the past. So we're talking about from the past up to the present, right? So we need present perfect, continuous. I have been listening to your podcast for 2 years. Okay, I have been listening. And I think once you forgot the preposition to. The rest of the times you didn't, but once you said listen the podcast. But of course, it's listen to the podcast. If you have an object with listen, you've always got to put in to.
And that's a very good piece of advice from Zeca about listening more than once to the podcast, especially if you want to work on your listening skills and your pronunciation. Just focus on a very short part of the podcast and repeat several times, trying to copy the way that we're pronouncing words, sentences, expressions, and try to copy our pronunciation. That's a very good way of improving your English. So thank you for that tip, Zeca.
One other little thing I noticed, you said he has many points. You were talking about New Zealand. Yes, I'm sure it does. Not he, because New Zealand's a country.
So New Zealand, we said in the introduction that New Zealand is otherwise known as the land of the long white cloud. And in the Maori language, that is from the word Aotearoa. I hope I've pronounced that well. Forgive me if I've made a mistake with that pronunciation. There are 2 main islands in New Zealand. There's the North Island and the South Island, and also 600 smaller islands that altogether make up the country of New Zealand. But where is it, Reza? Where is New Zealand located?
It's located in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. So clearly, Zeca from Brazil, he's a big fan of the Southern Hemisphere. He's from Brazil in Southern Hemisphere, and he loves New Zealand. So he likes it way down south there. We could say that it's the antipode to Spain. Now, what does that mean? Spain's in the Northern Hemisphere, right? Along with most of Europe. No, all of Europe. That means that it's a long way away. It's 20,000 kilometers away and 25 hours flight from Spain. Imagine you had a stick and you put it through the center of the earth, right?
It will come out at New Zealand.
From Spain. So Spain is exactly in the opposite side, the most opposite it could be to New Zealand. That's the antipode.
And you said it's a long way away. I think that's an understatement. I mean, you could say that Copenhagen's a long way away, or Badajoz in Extremadura is a long way away. New Zealand is an incredible distance from Spain, 25 hours in an aeroplane. I was lucky enough to visit New Zealand back in 2001, and I remember the flight never seemed to end. It was just so long, and it was worth the trip. Don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic country to visit, but it took so long to get there. 20,000 kilometers is a very long way.
Like many people, Craig, I very often associate New Zealand with Australia. And many people do. They have a lot in common. So you think, oh, that's because they're really close. It's not even that close to Australia.
No.
It's 2,000 kilometers away from Australia. That's a long distance. And they're about the closest neighbors. So even the neighbors are miles and miles away from anywhere.
And it's east of Australia. So imagine where Australia is and you go east, then you hit New Zealand. So Australia is west of New Zealand. And the third closest country to Antarctica is New Zealand. So after Chile and Argentina, New Zealand is the third closest to the South Pole.
As you can see, inglespodcast.com, we're very, very aware of our Southern Hemisphere because about half of our listeners are from the Southern Hemisphere. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, all those places, So
Australia.
Yeah, we do. We've got Alberto,
And
Gallego,
other people too.
from Australia, yeah. So we don't forget you guys from the Southern Hemisphere. That's why we're doing this podcast.
The capital of New Zealand is Wellington, and it's the southernmost capital in the world. However, it's not the largest and most populated city. That honour goes to Auckland. So as in some countries, for example, Canada is another example where you think it's the capital, you think Auckland's the capital, but no, it isn't. It just happens to be bigger than the capital, Wellington.
I must admit, my knowledge of cities and towns in New Zealand isn't good, but I would think of only three. I would think of Wellington and Auckland. The other one I would think of is Christchurch,
Which is in the South Island.
Have you been there as well on holiday?
Yes. We went to the North Island and half of the South Island because we went in August, which is summer here, but winter there. And we couldn't travel very far south because the southern island of New Zealand, being so close to the South Pole, gets a lot of snow, a lot of ice, there's lots of glaciers, and it was impossible to get further south than halfway down the southern island. Only 5 million people in New Zealand, so it doesn't have a huge population. When you think of Spain having 58, 57 million?
Something like that, yeah.
And 5 million only in New Zealand. Can you tell us anything about the flag?
Oh, the flags of countries, one of my favourite topics. I've always been interested in the New Zealand flag because it's very similar to that of Australia, and I bet loads of people couldn't tell them apart. But they aren't identical. They're similar, but they are not identical. And believe me, you never want to confuse a New Zealander with an Australian. They will be annoyed.
There's a friendly rivalry between the Australians and the New Zealanders, isn't there?
Yeah, but it's a bit like Canada and America. Don't call a Canadian an American, they don't like it. And it's the same with someone from New Zealand. Don't presume, oh, you must be an Australian. They won't like it.
No, it's like calling a Scotsman an Englishman or an Irishman an Englishman. Yeah, you'll offend someone.
So let's sort out the differences in the flags. They're not the same, and we don't want to mix them up. But they do have similarities, of course. Both flags have another flag inside them, the Union flag, or what most people call the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom. That appears in the top left corner, obviously representing the colonial ties with the UK. That's in both countries' flags. Also, both feature the Southern Cross constellation. That is a group of stars, a constellation, and that's on a blue background. Why the Southern Cross? Well, it's a constellation that can only be seen from the Southern Hemisphere, so it really highlights their geography. So they both have that. However, the Australian flag has an additional star in the bottom left quarter. So that's under the Union Jack. It has what's called the Commonwealth Star of its coat of arms. So that's not in the New Zealand flag.
So the extra star is because of the coat of arms of Australia?
Yep. And it's called the Commonwealth Star. So a further indication of their connection to the UK, the Commonwealth. Interestingly, the Kiwis decided to use only the 4 main stars, the principal stars of this Southern Cross constellation, which are easily visible. Whereas the Aussies, the Australians, they included a 5th smaller star.
We should explain here that when Reza said Kiwis, he's referring to the people from New Zealand. We'll explain that a bit later. And the Aussies is the nickname of Australians.
So it's really weird, isn't it? They both claim to represent this constellation, the Southern Cross, but in New Zealand they decided only to put the 4 stars, which are easy to see, whereas the Australians decided to include a 5th, which you can see, but it's much harder to see.
Maybe the Australians had a better telescope?
Could be as simple. Who knows? It's curious, isn't it? Another little difference is, curiously, same constellation, right? But the stars on the Australian flag are plain white, just white. Plain means with nothing else. Whereas on the New Zealand flag, there are red stars with white borders, the bit around them. Okay, so the colour is slightly different. And lastly, for the very keen observer of flags, while the Australian stars are 7-pointed, they have 7 points, they're 7-pointed, except for the smaller 5-pointed one, the one which is hard to see, all the stars on the New Zealand flag are 5-pointed. So they have very different representations of this Southern Cross, but they both feature it, only in different ways.
But you would only notice that if you were really, really a keen flag nerd like yourself.
Which I am. When I was a kid, I remember first seeing the New Zealand flag thinking, oh, look, somebody's done the Australian flag wrong. They put the stars red, but they should be white.
You noticed it.
I looked into it and realised, no, it's the New Zealand flag.
Just in case somebody out there has an interest in flags, is there anywhere they can see the flags and compare the differences?
Yes, I've included a link of an image of both flags side by side, beside each other, in the show notes. So just click on that and you'll see the differences. One more curious little bit of trivia. No, I shouldn't say trivia. It's interesting and it's not trivial at all, in fact. But I guess if you're not from New Zealand, you wouldn't know. And I wouldn't know if I hadn't looked on internet. In a referendum not long ago in 2016, around 57% of New Zealanders voted to keep the current flag rather than change to a new flag. So they had the chance to change. In that new flag, they mix the Southern Cross with a silver fern. That's a very symbolic plant because it's only found in New Zealand. So the silver fern was going to be in place of the Union Jack in the top left-hand corner. If you want to have a look at that proposed flag, I've put a link in the show notes as well. Craig, have you seen the proposed flag?
I haven't, but it's interesting that in the same year when the UK was voting on Brexit, New Zealand was voting on whether to put a silver fern on their flag in 2016.
Did you notice many ferns when you were in New Zealand?
I did, because when you go into the countryside and the beautiful forests, you do see a lot of ferns. And of course, the fern is very prominent, it's very clear on the All Blacks rugby team shirt. And it's an emblem, a very significant sign of the All Blacks rugby team that we'll speak about later.
So, Craig, you've been in New Zealand. Who lives there? Who are they?
Well, originally, if we go back to 1280, 1350, so quite a few hundred years ago, the original settlers came from Polynesian islands, from Oceania in the Pacific Ocean, so Polynesian. And they developed over a course of a few years the Maori culture. And if you think of the Aboriginal culture in Australia or the Native American culture, the Indians in the US, then the Maori culture is comparable because it was the original group of settlers that lived on the land way back in the 13th century.
What's driving like there? You've been there. Is it much different to the UK?
Well, they drive on the left because the British were the first Europeans to declare sovereignty over New Zealand. That happened in 1841. They have a long-standing history of British sovereignty.
So they were a British colony, right? But they're not now. Do you know when they stopped being a British colony?
They got their independence in 1947, and in 1947, the British sovereign, the person on the throne in Britain, became the New Zealand head of state. Listeners may have heard about the Commonwealth countries like Australia, Canada, some countries in Africa. Well, New Zealand became part of the Commonwealth of the UK, even though they had independence. They gained independence in 1947. And even now, the Queen is the Queen of New Zealand. So Queen Elizabeth II, at the time of recording this podcast, she is still the Queen, and she is also the Queen of New Zealand.
So today, most of the population of New Zealand is of European descent. The Maoris are the largest minority. They, at the minute, are about 15% of the total population. So obviously, they speak English for the colonial reasons that we've just talked about. But still, Maori is spoken by some people. Apart from people, sheep are very important in New Zealand. Yes, they are. They're very important because there are 9 sheep per person. It's the highest ratio of sheep in the world. And in fact, New Zealand lamb, the meat that comes from sheep, is exported all over the world. It's world famous.
And it's lovely. New Zealand lamb is really delicious. I've had it a few times. It's gorgeous. And it used to be really popular in the UK because they had a special agreement to ship lamb from New Zealand to the UK because of the ties in the Commonwealth.
Another nice food from New Zealand, of course, is the kiwi fruit. What do you know about kiwi fruit, Craig?
Well, I know that Daniela from Argentina may have been picking kiwis because she worked in orchards in New Zealand. Do you remember her message a few episodes ago? But actually, the kiwi is not native to New Zealand, and that surprised me. It actually comes from China. And they named the kiwi fruit after the flightless kiwi bird. Now, the kiwi bird is another emblem of the country, similar to the silver fern, and it's a bird that doesn't fly. So we say it's a flightless bird. And it's also a nickname that you can call people from New Zealand. They're very often referred to as Kiwis, in a similar way that you'd call me a Brit, for example, or someone from Australia an Aussie. So you've got Aussies, Brits, and Kiwis.
An interesting thing regarding the different types of words, the word classes. New Zealand is a country, so it's a proper noun. It's a noun, it's a sustantivo in Spanish. But you can also use New Zealand as an adjective. You can say the New Zealand flag, or that's a New Zealand boat. You can use it as an adjective. And if you want to talk about a person, then it's a New Zealander, add ER at the end.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't realised that because it's Spain, Spanish. It's the adjective. Britain, British. Yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't
But
happen with many
doesn't happen
countries.
with New Zealand.
That the country is also the adjective.
Another interesting fact about New Zealand, it has the longest place name in any English-speaking country. And it's a word with 85 letters. You can see it in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/344.
Does it mean anything?
It does, yes. And this is the translation into English. So that Maori place name actually means, well, it's the name of a hill on the North Island. And the rough translation to English is the summit where Tamatea, the man with the big knees, the climber of mountains, the land swallower who travelled about, played his nose flute to his loved one.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of information for a place name.
Actually, I've got a similar one for me and you. Would you like to hear them?
Yeah.
So on the same theme, we could name a hill. If you name the hill after me, it will be Craig, the man with the big nose, the producer of podcasts, the chocolate swallower who used to travel about and now spends far too much time on Zoom. Would you like to hear yours?
Go on, give it to me.
Reza, the man with a Belfast accent, the pineapple swallower who has an affection for sloths and helps people from all over the world with their English. So if you do speak Maori, maybe you could translate those sentences for Reza and I, and we can put them on our business cards. One lovely thing I noticed travelling around New Zealand was that people were so very nice. Everyone was so friendly. They have a really good sense of humour, and they're just nice people. Really, really nice people. So it's not surprising that it's the least corrupt country in the world. Now, this is according to the Corruption Perception Index, and there's a link to that in the show notes. Along with Denmark, Denmark is also known as not being corrupt. So Denmark and New Zealand scored really, really high in the anti-corruption perception.
Craig, let's talk about some famous Kiwis. We don't mean the birds or the fruit, but we mean New Zealanders. Well, let's start, sorry for the pun, let's start at the top. Let's start at the top because we're going to Mount Everest. Of course, the highest mountain in the world. It was a New Zealander, Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first person to climb Mount Everest, along with his guide and helper, Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. A Sherpa is someone from native to that part of the world of Mount Everest. Would it be Nepal?
Nepal, yeah, it's a Nepalese name.
That was in 1953, not that long ago.
Another famous person from New Zealand, Russell Crowe, the actor, famously starred in Gladiator, among other many good films. He was born in Wellington in 1964, so he's a year younger than I am. He's maybe more famous for his connections to Australia because he moved to Australia and spent many years there. But he was born in Wellington, so he's a Kiwi.
The next one is a name which was a very big name when I was a kid growing up, perhaps not so much now. Dame Kirita Kanawa. It sounds Maori because indeed she is half Maori and half European. In her lineage, that's where you come from, your parents. So she had a Maori parent and another parent who was of European descent. And she's regarded as one of the greatest soprano voices of all time. And also she was very widely admired for her great beauty on stage. If you check her out on internet, if you've never seen a picture of her, a very, very attractive woman. And when she sang, she had a great voice, a great presence. She was called Dame because that's the female equivalent of Sir. So we mentioned Sir Edmund Hillary. He was given the title Sir for getting up Everest first. And Dame Kirita Kanawa was given the title Dame for her contribution to the world of opera and singing.
And she does have a beautiful voice. I've heard her on CDs and other songs. She's really, really talented. So go and have a listen. I'm sure she's on YouTube somewhere. Another famous Kiwi is Ernest Rutherford. He is known as the father of nuclear physics. He did lots of groundbreaking work in nuclear physics. Groundbreaking means new, original, something that hasn't been done before, breaking the ground for future scientists. And he won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. So a famous Kiwi in science is Ernest Rutherford.
A name that often comes to mind when you think of cars, Formula One, is McLaren. Did you know that Bruce McLaren is, or was he still alive?
No, and the reason I added this to the list yesterday before we recorded this podcast is because I recently saw a documentary about him on, I think it was Netflix. He died in practice. He was testing a car and he died on the track. But there's a very good biography of his life as a racing driver and engineer and his Kiwi team. He had a really, really good, groundbreaking team of car engineers, designers, racers, and it's a really interesting documentary. And I watched it yesterday and I did not know about this man and I did not know that he was from New Zealand. So yeah, Bruce McLaren. You've heard of McLaren racing cars.
Another name that I'm sure many of our listeners do know for sure is Peter Jackson, the film director. Or if you don't know his name, I'm sure you know some of his films, such as The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, King Kong. So he's a very, very well-known and highly respected film director from New Zealand.
And you may or may not know that Lord of the Rings was mainly filmed in New Zealand, demonstrating the beautiful landscapes and the geography and the forests and the trees of New Zealand. And the film generated $200 million in revenue. Revenue is the money they got for making the films there. And it was such a big deal in New Zealand, a fairly small country, that they actually appointed a special government minister for Lord of the Rings to manage the money and the business side of the filming in New Zealand. So they had a government minister. You have a government minister for transport. You have a government minister for foreign affairs. And they had a government minister for Lord of the Rings. What a fantastic thing to have in your business card.
Another thing that people often associate with New Zealand is extreme sports in general, and particularly the bungee jump, because the first commercial bungee jump was in New Zealand in 1988 at the Kawarau Bridge in Queenstown. Queenstown is known as the extreme sports capital of the world. So New Zealanders like their thrilling sporting activities a lot.
And we went there when we were in New Zealand and we jumped off that bridge. We actually jumped from the bridge. It's not the highest. It's not the highest bungee jump you can do in New Zealand. But because it was the original bridge and we were in Queensland, we did it, yeah.
How did it feel?
It didn't feel natural because when you're up on the bridge, it's not a natural thing to throw yourself off of the bridge. You look down and you think, no, I don't really want to do this. But the guy, the Kiwi who actually tied the bungee to my legs was very, very clever. He asked me where I was from. I said, well, I live in Spain, but originally from the UK. He says, oh, you're British, eh? You're British. I said, yeah. He said, the British here, they're the worst. They usually chicken out. They wait too long. They don't jump. You guys have got a really bad reputation for jumping off the bridge. So, of course, I thought, okay, I'm going to show this guy. I'm going to show him that British people have courage and we're brave. And I just jumped. And when I thought about it after, I thought he probably says that to every nationality. He says that to the Italians, the French, the Dutch, everybody. I jumped.
Craig, we can't finish talking about Australia without mentioning rugby. You briefly mentioned it before, but we need to say a bit more about rugby.
Yeah, the All Blacks. The All Blacks, the national team of New Zealand, have an incredible record in the sport of rugby. They have a 77% winning record in test match rugby. the only international men's team to have more wins than losses against every opponent. Just think about that for a second. Obviously, some countries are easier to beat than others, but you know there are very strong rugby nations like South Africa, Australia, England, but the All Blacks have beaten those strong countries more times than they've lost against them. Do you have any more facts about their team?
Yes, since their debut, that's spelled D-E-B-U-T, when something begins, since their international debut in 1903, New Zealand teams have played test matches against 19 nations, because not all countries in the world play rugby, so 19 nations, of which 11 of those 19 have never won a game against the All Blacks. That's how good they are. So the majority have never been able to beat New Zealand. And since the introduction of the World Rugby Rankings in 2003, New Zealand has held the number one ranking longer than all the other teams combined.
And it's very much part of the society. I remember when I was there, everybody spoke about rugby. Everybody knew the names of every member of the All Blacks team. And I was with my wife in a supermarket queuing up to buy some food. And in front of us in the queue, there were two fairly old ladies. They must have been in their mid-70s. And they were arguing about whether one of the New Zealand rugby players should be substituted or not, should be removed from the team or put into the starting lineup of the team. And I was amazed that everybody was involved, almost like a religion, in the game of rugby. So it's something we can say that permeates through New Zealand society, from the young to the old. Whatever class you are, whatever job you have, you probably are a rugby fan.
And very importantly, European and Maori. Both lineages are very, very keen on rugby. It's not just a white sport, it's for Maoris as well.
One thing that's taken from the Maori culture, if you watch a New Zealand international match, you'll see the New Zealand team performing a haka, that's H-A-K-A, before every match. Well, what is a haka? It's a Maori challenge or posture dance. It's very emotional, it's very tribal, and if you want to see an example, we've put a link in the show notes at the beginning of a game with France where the All Blacks haka intimidates the French before the start of the game. So go to inglespodcast.com/344, and if you've never seen a New Zealand All Black haka, then I strongly suggest you go and have a look.
So, now it's your turn to practice your English. Why don't you send us a voice message? Just go to speakpipe.com/EnglishPodcast and record an audio, and we'd be delighted to play it on the show.
Absolutely. And have you been to New Zealand? Have you worked or are you working in New Zealand? Do you have any comments or questions on today's podcast? We'd be very happy to hear from you. You can also contact us by email. Send an email to my email address, that's Craig, C-R-A-I-G, @inglespodcast.com, or belfastreza, that's R-E-Z-A, @gmail.com. You can also visit the Mansion Ingles online store at store.mansioningles.net, where there are courses for sale, and especially if you're thinking of taking the B2 First exam, there's a course there that's only €12 and will prepare you for taking the Cambridge First Certificate exam.
As always, we'd like to thank all our Patreon supporters. And if you go to Patreon, that's Patreon, patreon.com/EnglishPodcast, you can see a full list of all our supporters. We'd like to name them all, but we haven't got time. What we will do is we'll name our most recent supporters who've decided to donate to us through Patreon. They are Christian Garcia Magro, Raquel Sanchez, Peri Crespi Cabot, Antonio Murillo, Luis Lobo Martinez, Marina Rueda, Beatriz, and Josep Chirvent. Thank you very much to those people and all those who sponsor us through Patreon.
Yes, thank you very, very much. If you'd like to join those lovely people for as little as $1 per month, which works out to about $1.20 when you include the VAT, the value-added tax. You get instant access to recent transcriptions. Again, go to patreon.com/Ingles podcast. And special thanks to Marina, to Beatriz, and to Josep, who increased their support to a little more than the $1. So thank you very, very much. What's next week, Reza?
Next week we've got how to be indirect and polite in English.
That's very kind of you. Look forward to speaking about that next week. Thank you for listening this week. Until next time, it's goodbye from Reza.
And bye-bye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.